explained to me, confessed to me, that yes, as a deliberate matter of policy, Gingrich and Dick Armey and Tom DeLay would come to him as chairman of the Appropriations and say, we need to do something for this member, we need to do something for that member. He's in a tight race, he's in a difficult district, we got to help him bring home some bacon. And under this regime, the number of earmarks dramatically increased. Gingrich himself was the leading promoter of this, a fact that I think he's tended to forget in recent years. Republicans also cultivated corporate lobbyists. This is the famous K Street Project, which you've heard about, in which Tom DeLay organized a system by which lobbyists didn't just have access, they actually were invited to write legislation to suggest bills, which the Republicans, believing that they were the pro-business party, were happy to help promote in many cases. Drug company lobbyists, for example, as the president pointed out, President Obama the other night, really did write the legislation that provided the Medicare drug benefit. And in return, of course, for all this, the favored interests contributed heavily and did indeed help Gingrich and his team keep the majority for a long time, from '94 until 2006. Is all this corrupt? It's a wonderful quotation from Russell Long, Huey Long's son, the very talented legislator, chairman of the Senate Finance Committee for many years. In a debate in the Senate in the early 70s on campaign finance reform, he said something quite wonderful, I thought. He said, the difference between a campaign contribution and a bribe is just a hairline's difference. I think that's right. Jack Abramoff told his friends and acquaintances after he got caught, after his career as a lobbyist had ended, he told people, I participated in a system of legalized bribery. That was Abramoff's term. That's what it was, legalized bribery. But in Washington, it gets rationalized away. And we've seen this, and you know it, you've heard it yourselves. Everybody does it. They're not buying my vote, they're just showing that they support me. And people settle into this system. One of the most interesting people I met doing the reporting for this book was a really charming and bright young man who came to town to work for his own congressman from California and stayed to become a professional fundraiser. His name is Mike Frioli, and he runs Mike Frioli and Associates. He raises money for Democratic members of the House and Senate. And Frioli told me how this system works, which I was aware of, but it had never really been spelled out for me. Frioli's business is to, when retained by a member of Congress or a candidate, a challenger, his first task is to produce lists of possible donors. He's very proud of the databases that he has assembled in his own computers in his office half a mile from here, where he tries to sort out political action committees, wealthy individuals, interest groups that make contributions, by categories which suggest the kinds of members or challengers that they might be willing to support. He then produces long lists with telephone numbers, names and telephone numbers, which he gives to his clients. And their job is, as the members themselves now call it, to go out and dial for dollars. Now, you're not allowed as a member of Congress to call from your office to raise money. You have to go, as most of them do, to one of the party clubhouses on Capitol Hill to make these phone calls. And what Frioli explained to me was that it's now absolutely normal for members of the House and the Senate to spend 1, 2, 3 days a week dialing for dollars, making these phone calls one after another after another. Now, this is on our time. We are taxpayers. We're paying the salaries while they're making the phone calls. And it isn't just in election years. That's what's changed. It's all the time. And I've confirmed this. I'm doing a new reporting project on Capitol Hill and was with a number of freshmen early this year, their first year in office, and they often were excusing themselves to go off to make these phone calls. And I think it's quite demeaning. As Frioli said to me, not everybody says yes. In fact, far from it. The congressman or candidate making these calls has got to be prepared for some pretty rude responses and a lot of very firm no's. Again, I see a disincentive to the kind of people that I would like to see in my Congress. Who wants to put up with that demeaning way of life of calling up, asking people for money, often being yelled at and told no? It's not exactly the statesmanship one suspects that our founders had in mind when they imagined the House and the Senate. I argue in the book that the money culture has created, significantly contributed to, if not created itself, the culture of avoidance that has been so prevalent in Congress for so long. Think of all the big issues that have been avoided for the last 20, 30 years. It's intriguing, of course, we now have a new president who's trying to take them all on, and he's widely, and I suppose understandably, accused of trying to do too much. But you know, Harry Truman introduced the idea of health insurance 50 years ago. Nothing was done. Global warming has been seen to be a serious problem for quite a long time. Nothing was done. My favorite example really is Medicare and Social Security. Demographic facts, well advertised, confronted in the early 80s by Bob Dole and Ronald Reagan and others, and dealt with quite creatively in 1982 or 3, but never since. And we've known forever and ever that the demographics were inevitable, that we're going to have more and more old people, that these programs are going to be more and more expensive. I remember asking some reporters on the Post to write stories in 1993 when Bill Clinton came to town, explaining that Clinton would have to confront Social Security and Medicare because there was no longer any avoiding them. But we avoided them. Why? I argue here in the book that the real function of the lobbying culture is not to make smarmy things happen. That happens sometimes. But the really most common form of lobbying is to stop things from happening, is to play defense. It's much easier, any member of Congress will tell you, to stop a bill than to pass a bill. And that's what happens all the time. And I do believe that one of the functions of this bad thing that's developed, this bad system that's developed, is that it's much easier not to do something than to do something. And indeed, we've been not doing a lot of stuff for a great many years. Now we have a new reality. We've had the worst economic crisis in decades, and a new president who ran against, quite literally, the culture of avoidance. And he's actually promised to confront all the big issues that were avoided for so long. I think this agenda may just be too big to be accommodated by the system that we have created. I'm intrigued by the fact that Obama seems to understand the culture of corruption in Washington pretty much the way I do. He only had 4 years in the Senate before he became president, and really only 2 years before he started running for the job. But he figured us out. He's a pretty good cultural anthropologist, I think. He talked about the problem in interesting ways in the campaign. Washington is broken, he said in one speech. Lobbyists and special interests have turned our government into a game that only they can afford to play. Politics is no longer a mission, he said on another occasion. It's a business. He issued on his second day in office an interesting executive order. You've heard about it. It was an attempt to gum up at least the revolving door. He said, anybody who's been a lobbyist cannot be a member of my administration and work on this subject matter that he or she lobbied on as a lobbyist. He also said that anybody who works here has got to sign a formal pledge that says, I'm not going to become a lobbyist when I leave, for at least for the duration of this administration. It could be as much as through 2 terms, of course. I think it's a meaningful executive order, and yet it's been fraught with difficulties and complications, partly because, as you have to do when you issue such a sweeping order, he had to allow for exceptions, and we learned almost immediately of 2 really important exceptions. The Deputy Secretary of Defense that was somehow indispensable to the Obama administration was a guy called William Lynn, who was, for the previous years, the lobbyist in Washington for Raytheon, a leading defense contractor. Mr. Geithner chose as his chief of staff in the Treasury an official of Goldman Sachs, and an exception had to be made for him because he'd been a lobbyist in Washington for Goldman Sachs. I think it was too sweeping, this order, and of course it ruled out lots of people who had been lobbyists, registered lobbyists, but lobbyists for nonprofit organizations, the Sierra Club, or human rights groups, or a lot of other things. But merely registering as a lobbyist got you into hot water at the Obama White House. I also see in this new reality that we've got powerful signs that the old culture hasn't really changed. The cap and trade bill that was passed in the House, the Markey-Waxman bill, is full of concessions and payoffs to special interests, which it was felt by all concerned had to be placated or no bill would be passed. The environmental groups now think that the bill that was passed wasn't very good, but it may be better than the Senate could do. The Senate may not be able to do anything, partly because energy issues have such wonderfully rich, conflicting regional complications in our country, but also because the interests are so strong. The problem here is that one new president with a fresh view and a determination to change things isn't by himself going to be able to overturn a culture that I think has become extremely well established and won't change by itself. And of course, there's a rich irony here now, which is that if we're going to change this stuff, we have to have it will have to be changed by the very people, members of the House and Senate, who benefit from the system that we have and have figured out how to make it work for them. Will they ever have the stomach, the courage, to really change what's going on here? Interestingly, the Supreme Court may resolve the whole thing for us through this very unexpected and unusual case that they heard argued just a few weeks ago at the beginning of the term, before the formal beginning of the term, apparently because of an initiative taken by the new Chief Justice, Mr. Roberts, and his new sidekick, Sam Alito, who decided really out of the blue and to the amazement of the campaign finance reform community to reopen the question of whether all the different laws that have limited and controlled corporate contributions to political campaigns are in fact now maybe unconstitutional after all, although the Supreme Court has repeatedly upheld their constitutionality over the last 20 years. I wrote about this in the Outlook section a few weeks ago. It's quite astounding to me, but if it becomes possible for big companies to directly contribute to political campaigns, not into the campaign funds of the candidates themselves, that would remain illegal, but they could be authorized, if the Supreme Court makes this decision the way some fear that they will, it could become possible for big companies to run their own campaigns for or against particular candidates. And I shudder to think what might happen in a world like that if corporations were running campaigns against sitting members, had the success of defeating one or two, how loud suddenly would the voices of their lobbyists become afterwards when they came to ask for a favor. I hope we don't have to live to see that, but we might. So, I'm sorry we're not able to offer books for sale tonight. They're still available on Amazon and elsewhere. I hope that I've explained my theory briefly, but of course, there's absolutely no way to understand it fully without reading the book.